Okay, so this is going to be over Tall Paul. um, Paul Wintle Jr., better known as Tall Paul, was on the rise, engaging in the Twin Cities scene of hip hop stars. Um, he is still alive today and is middle aged. I think in his mid 50s. And he's really kind of just blown up the scene of rappers involved with the indigenous and that native roots behind him. And he sang primarily about his indigenous roots and his pride and the pride he gained from it. He was the one person that actually kind of saw the benefit in the him being that Native American, and just he really loved and evolved that into what it is today. Um, in an article, it states, I started writing rhymes when I was about 14 years old, just toying around with it. It was a hobby for many years, but it gradually evolved into something more. I think that's really big. I mean, he's starting young. He wanted to change the world, which is just inspirational. And again, he started very young and began to take a liking into it. Speaking his roots, wanted to voice his own voice to the world, and the thoughts he wanted to voice out into the world, which were so important to nowadays, just being that inspiration and leaving that impact behind. He began his career in the Twin Cities in the year 2009. One of his most famous albums he dedicated to Olympian Jim Thorpe, who was also a Native American. Um, the reason he did this was because he was inspired by Jim Thorpe. Jim Thorpe inspired Tall Paul by being a native superstar in sports, and this made Tall Paul really want to sing about his memory and kind of honor Jim Thorpe. They needed to get his story out there. Article states Winnow dedicated an entire album in 2022 to honoring his memory. They wanted to know what he left behind, what legacy he left, which is important to speak out. Tall Paul says, he had a huge impact on me as a young Native youth growing up in the 90s. Nowadays, we see a little bit more of a positive and ample representation of our indigenous communities, but back then it was much more limited. This is again, back then it was much more limited. Now it is opening up. The broadness of this is now from these people like Jim Thorpe and even Tall Paul now. He is kind of opening, breaking the boundaries. There's a lot more like love going around with for these people, and just we're kind of all trying to start work our way into society, and this is just really big. And he was just a really important part of it. He cared so much about getting his indigenous part of his roots out there and inspiring so many people to join his journey, and so many people younger than him that are like him to just kind of just break out and talk about it. And it's really important that he found these indigenous roots of his and just kind of just spoke them, which is very important. Um, Tall Paul was so inspired by his indigenous connections to Olympian Jim Thorpe, and this really sparked the fire in Tall Paul's career. He was a member of the Ojibwe and Oneida at the Leech Lake Reservation in Minnesota and learned to use indigenous roots to tip the scale in his favor. This is super important because, again, he really loved to emphasize his indigenous roots. Some people are going to hide that and kind of just try to fit into the norm. No, he wanted to talk about what he had to go through, all the struggle he had to go through, which is super important. Just a little bit of a song that he had.
Born in Indian territory, Oklahoma. With this team, brother Charlie, just south of Belmont, Florida. Ain't no front cabin with the Woodstock aroma. Not too long before we walked up a young Avoca. Baby, it was given the name of a dead cut. It meant the night after the lightning, it's his clean cut. Thunder claim just like his daddy gives he black cut. Known as the bright man, destined to be his man rock.
Hey, D Mill, can we run that back one time? Yeah, that's the one. We're good. I was born and raised in South Minneapolis. When I was about 14 years old is when I picked up the pen and pad and started writing raps. It was just something for me to do to keep me feeling like I had a purpose in life, you know? Growing up, I didn't have any positive role models who were pushing me to do excellent things with my life. My dad wasn't around. He had been
I think it's important how he mentions he didn't have any important role models growing up. And when he went into the world of kind of music and started writing, he found Jim Thorpe. And I know people look up to people like their parents usually, and he mentioned his dad wasn't around. Um, I think he kind of fell under the impression that Jim Thorpe was his role model. I mean, the one who kind of drove him to be who he thought he needed to be to break out into this world and to show everybody how important it is to voice your own opinions. And I think that's just really cool how a lot of people are just gonna kind of break off and fall and just quit, and he just stood up and he's like, you know what, I'm not gonna fall into that. I'm going to make myself better. I'm gonna look up to this guy who was like me. He made it out, so I know I can make it out. And I think that's just inspirational and just really cool. This album he made about Jim Thorpe really sparked true connections with being a member of an indigenous people. And I believe this is what made him so much better because he felt like he had something to fight for and something to teach and about and something to voice. He had felt he had something he wanted to change, and he knew that if he was able to change it, he would prevent other people to from falling in the gutter and just not making it out, which is important. He left a lot of influences, that's for sure. And of course, Jim Thorpe is the biggest influence on Tall Paul there ever is, and he's the reason he is who he is today. He would have most likely never found that connection to the superstar world, and he probably wouldn't be who he is today if it wasn't for his honestly, if it wasn't for his parents not really being his role model. So he went out and found Jim Thorpe, and it kind of like really projectiled him in the right direction, and that's just super important for him being influenced by this guy who was like him, this Olympian, this superstar. Um, Jim Thorpe was his greatest inspiration, and that is exactly why he made an entire album honoring his memory, because he wanted everyone with these indigenous roots and just everyone in general to see that everyone can be great at something if they really try. You can always make it out. You can always do it. You just have to put effort and just go. Um, Tall Paul actually influenced a lot of people. I found this one person he strongly influenced, Tanya Winder. Tanya wanted to amplify artists with indigenous backgrounds around the world to help get their voices out. But she wasn't unsure. She was really unsure and didn't know where to start or how to start. And she thought of one person who she claimed was the best ever at getting their voice out, and that man was Tall Paul. When she heard in Tall Paul, the best, she claimed that he was the best MC out there. She said, if I'm going to do this, let's have the best, the article says. And article also states, when he was so influential, and as stated in the article, Winneal envisions supporting indigenous artists with streamlined access to resources and opportunities through Dream Warriors. Um, this just kind of shows how much Tall Paul can kind of pass on Jim Thorpe's influences through him into people that are younger and trying to make it up and out. Um, Themes. After looking over some lyrics and listening to the song like that one he kind of played in the YouTube video, um, he's more of a modern era rapper. You know, we're kind of also talking about other things in this class, like like the guys who kind of made it hip hop who it is, but he didn't necessarily make hip hop what it is. He kind of amplified it in a way to different boundaries. And he is more of a modern era rapper, in my opinion. I mean, he's something that sings songs that I would probably listen to now, uh, being in my generation. And in his song Keepin' On, he talks about how he had moments of anger in his song, stated in an article. As I was writing this album, there were definitely moments of anger, just thinking about a lot of stuff that Jim Horth had to go through. Um, and I think that was the theme of his music because he was so adamant on what his people had to go through. He was upset and he was angry when he was singing, and I think that made him kind of express the emotion. You can really hear that in him. He used the anger to express how upset it made him feel. Like just showing how he was just struggling to survive, let alone attempt to make it out. That's why he found Jim Thorpe so inspiring because of what he did and how he made it out and broke the boundary. The impressions he left. In Tall Paul's album about Jim Thorpe, he can really be seen as leaving such a huge impression on his culture, just strictly based off of the fact that he sang about his roots and his indigenous past and his indigenous personality. Um, Leaving a legacy behind is such a crucial thing nowadays, and I believe that hip hop in every way has been evolved for the better because of people like Tall Paul who showed that you can make it if you just try. Tall Paul, still being alive today, has already left such an amazing mark on his world. And for Native people like him to climb out and break the boundaries and become their own superstar, I think Tall Paul is one of the most inspirational people you can find, just breaking that Indigenous boundary and just being who you are, voicing your own opinion, and making it out. Thank you.